Before the goddess of justice, you are worthy. Embrace our gifts and rise, Ascendant. For there's nothing quite so enticing as ascendancy. Ooh.
Hello everybody, it is I, Brian the Pirate. In today's video, I want to give you the everything you need to know about the Legacy of Phrecia event. The what, the when, and the why. That last one I think is particularly important because I'm seeing some discourse between like the PoE 1 and the PoE 2 Andes, and I want to address it briefly because I think it's a little bit silly, but due to, for the large part, to naivety, and I want to just fill in some gaps that will help maybe the two parties understand each other a little bit better. I'll also be covering some of, but not all of the ascendancies. The reason for that is because there's 19 of the buggers. How long do you want this video to be? Let's start off with the what. The Legacy of Phrecia event is, as the name event implies, an event. Who knew? But it's not a league that some of you may be a little bit confused about. So the event is going to be for a month in length, potentially a little bit longer, and I'll talk more on that a little bit later. But it's an event that you will be able to select from the screen underneath where your characters are usually chosen. So there's like, usually when they have events, either private leagues and things like that, like a Zizarin's Gauntlet, this is where it will appear. On the 20th of February, this is where it's going to appear. You'd click on that, you'd make a character from that selection screen. Then after a month, I imagine what's going to happen is GGG will see how popular the event is. And also, they will probably see how far the content release for PoE 2 is going to be as well. And I imagine if they need a little bit more time, and if the event is quite popular, they'll likely extend the event. If they're doing quite well with the content for Path of Exile 2 and are ready to release it, then you'll probably find the event will abruptly halt. And then they'll be like, here's the new PoE 2 content and the economy reset and all that shenanigans. Which hopefully likewise means that in another, I don't know, 2 or so months, there will actually be the 3.26, I want to say, league coming for Path of Exile 1. Now, the idea of this month-long event is to provide a bunch of content for the people who enjoy Path of Exile 1, who have been essentially starved of content during the release of Path of Exile 2. It's going to consist of 19 new ascendancies. They will only be during the event, and then it will go back to the original ascendancies when the new league comes out. And it also will consist of redoing the end game just a little bit. So the mapping system will stay the same, but they're going to be implementing a previous idea that they came up with that they originally scrapped in favor of the Atlas tree. That's another thing I want to just quickly expand upon. The features that we're getting during this event are all things that GGG had already made. These are things that they had made, and then they went, that's a little bit unbalanced, or it's not that great, or it doesn't feel too good. We'll push it to the side, we'll save it maybe for a rainy day when we can revamp it and things like that, which is why they've been able to throw this together so quickly. There's been a lot of discourse online, and they have since addressed it with an FAQ, which I'll be linking below in the description. A lot of people think this is experimental stuff that they want for PoE 2, and it's not. It's stuff they already made. That's why it's all thrown together and come together so quickly. They did not just design all of this in a matter of a week. That did not happen. They've literally had all this stuff in some folders hidden away because they're like, nah, that's broken, it doesn't work. And they're going, well, let's just throw something together that will be fun to mess around with and just see what the players come up with these crazy, wacky experimental ascendancies and experimental endgame Atlas system. There's going to be 19 ascendancies. All of them are going to be linked in the video description below. Almost every single one of them is broken in some way, shape, or form. A lot of them are essentially based on a unique item that exists in the game already, and they've kind of tweaked it and then added it as a passive skill. There is literally one ascendancy that blatantly references items and is based on the items in a quite literal manner, but you'll see a pattern throughout all the other ascendancies where you'll be like, oh, that's something that you can get on this item or on this passive node usually, and it's been integrated into the ascendancy instead. That's kind of cool. A lot of them are very broken. Some of them you look at and you think, wow, we're going to be able to do some real crazy shit with these ascendancies. And yeah, that's why they've never actually come to the game. So for those of you not familiar with Path of Exile 1 or relatively new to Path of Exile 1, you've got the Atlas system, which you may be aware of, but before that, there was nothing. You just went to the mapping system, you did the maps, and it was fine. People enjoyed it, obviously, and they played it a lot. But then they introduced the Atlas passive system. This system gave you, the player, a vast amount of control to focus on the type of content that you really enjoy, because the idea of Path of Exile 1 is there is so much content, you have no obligation to do all of it, but you have the option to focus on the things that you really, really enjoy and ignore the things that you don't. This system, this Atlas passive system, will enable you to enhance the content that you enjoy, enable you to farm it more effectively with even more challenge in some places, and then you can trade whatever you gain from those systems with people who focused on other systems, and that way you can still acquire all the aspects of the loot from the events that you otherwise ignore. Now, the introduction of that system was massive. It made the endgame content in Path of Exile 1 so peak, as the kids may say, that it's basically, I don't think it could be outdone in any way, shape, or form, frankly, other than maybe some slight UI changes and the introduction of more and cooler passives. The Legacy of Phrecia event, however, they are getting rid of that for the event only. Just, you know, calm down. It's just for the event. They're getting rid of the Atlas passive system and introducing one of the other ideas they came up with. Now, it's an idol-based system. It's kind of like what you might see in Last Epoch, the relic, the idol system there. In fact, you have like a little box where you can put idols where they give you permanent passive buffs. Or if you're familiar with Sanctum in Path of Exile 1 or the Trial of Sechemas in Path of Exile 2, you've got this box that you can put these little relics in this case idols, and they give you these passive buffs like permanently. In this case, that enhance the type of content that you like to do at endgame. Now, the idea of these idols is that they are going to be very similar to the nodes you would have otherwise found on the Atlas passive tree in the standard game, but a lot more overtuned, let's say. So like, these are just arbitrary numbers, but to give you an idea of scale, like something that might give you like 12% additional chance to open a strongbox on the Atlas passive tree, on one of these idols could be something like 50%. Again, I'm making these numbers up, but to give you an idea of the scale that you'd be looking at, which means that when you get the idols that you want, you could really, really break some of these endgame systems, and, you know, probably to a laughable means. GGG themselves have kind of like joked about how they've had to tune some of them down, because you could, for example, literally just be permanently reopening the same strongbox again and again and again and again. And I have no doubt that that is still achievable, but you'll just need to dedicate yourself to all of the strongbox relics. I think it's going to be a very cool system. I think there's going to be some definite shenanigans that we're going to come across, and they've already addressed some of the concerns that people had with like map sustain early game. They've basically said that like early game you will be getting like more map orientated idols. The frequency at which these idols drop should be relatively frequent. I'm sure if they're not as frequent as we would like, it's just a case of, you know, tuning a number slightly. Personally, I'm looking forward to just doing some weird and crazy shit with some of my favorite endgame systems. You will also receive rewards for playing the game at level 20, 40, 60, and 80. You will respectively get a boots, gloves, body armor, and helmet, part of a specific set, the Autumn Night Armor set. There will also be a Twitch drop, which is related to that same set. That will be, Twitch drops will be running from the 20th of February all the way through to the 27th of February. So just watch your favorite streamer. It's the Havenwood cloak to be specific, but basically synergizes with the Autumn Night armor set that you'll be getting. And do note that this armor set and this cloak will, of course, eventually work, if not immediately, in Path of Exile 2 as well. So if you are just a Path of Exile 2 Andy, maybe it's worth just getting the event and playing the event, just get level 80 and, you know, get some free cosmetics, because Path of Exile 2 is a little starved of cosmetics at the moment, and it's a genuinely cool looking set as well. Now, as I said, I want to touch on the why the event is happening before I cover some of the ascendancies. Now, most of you watching this video probably already know the why, because you're a fan of Path of Exile 1. You've been seeing the conversation that's been around it, and for those of you who know that, I apologize, but I want to explain for the people who are new to the channel, who probably only started following through Path of Exile 2, and maybe you're watching this because you like the words that come out of the funny little Englishman. So this next brief section is for you guys. So the discourse I've been seeing between Path of Exile 1 Andes and Path of Exile 2 Andes is Mostly if Path of Exile 2, Andy, is not understanding why GGG are still bothered about Path of Exile 1. And I can understand where that confusion is coming from, because usually with any other game, when there is a sequel, the idea is you move on from that game onto the sequel, because the sequel is supposed to be a vast improvement in every way, shape, and form, usually on the predecessor. That is not the case with Path of Exile 2. So for those of you new to Path of Exile who just entered through Path of Exile 2, Path of Exile 2 was originally intended to be part of Path of Exile 1. It was supposed to be one game, one client, with 2 campaigns. You would choose between the first campaign and then the new campaign, shared end game. And the idea was just to improve the engine a little bit and add a couple of quality of life things. During the development of Path of Exile 2, though, they discovered that it would be easier and better to make a second engine based on the first one, which is why it's so easy to transfer things across, to improve the rigging to the points where they wanted to. And as they were developing it, they ended up just adding more scope to the project than they initially intended. And that's why they were like, okay, it's a separate game. With that in mind, the developers were very cognizant of the fact that the play styles between the 2 games are intended to be very, very different. Path of Exile 2, some of you may not be aware of this, it's actually supposed to be really like slow and deliberate in comparison to what you're seeing in Endgame at the moment. And when I've spoken on this before to people who are new to Path of Exile, they're usually like, wait, what, really? Yes, really. Like what you see in Endgame in Path of Exile 2 at the moment is not intended. Endgame is broken, for lack of a better phrase. The game is far, far, far way and above than it should be in terms of speed, in terms of clear, in terms of how much damage you can do. The developers have somewhat memed on it and said like, no, we no longer measure damage per second, we measure comets per second. Path of Exile 2 is supposed to be a lot more focused on the action, where you are incentivized heavily, or supposed to be heavily incentivized, into using multiple skills through regular combat. And it's supposed to be situational. So some skills you won't use until specific situations. Some skills you will combine to get the added effects of synergizing them together. It's supposed to be a lot more tactical. It's supposed to be a lot more meaningful and deliberate and, again, slower. Now, obviously, that isn't the case. And if you actually like the combat that you've been experiencing in Endgame Path of Exile 2, you're probably going to like Path of Exile 1. Because Path of Exile 1 is supposed to be like that. That's crazy fast, press one button, spam that one button to win the game kind of gameplay. That's intended there. Whereas Path of Exile 2, it's not intended. And a lot of people are aware of that. And what the combat you probably more likely experience during the campaign is more akin to what it's supposed to be in Path of Exile 2. So the people who are aware of that don't necessarily like that, and they want to stick with Path of Exile 1. Path of Exile 1 hasn't had a new league for 7 months, bearing in mind it's supposed to be every quarter. Also bear in mind the developers promised, they didn't just like allude to, they did specifically promise and say to the community that they would co-develop the 2 games and they wouldn't be impacting each other. Now, it turns out they weren't able to fulfill that promise. I think people accusing them of lying are being a little bit weird, to be honest. I don't think they deliberately lied in any way, shape, or form. They just fell into a hole they couldn't get out of, basically, and they've dug more than they can, handle, or bit more than they can chew, whatever, pick your analogy. They just didn't understand the scope of the work required, and now they're having to recover from the amount of work that they're having to actually do. The end game was far more broken in Path of Exile 2 than they anticipated. They've literally said as much, and that's upset a lot of the Path of Exile 1 community, which is an extensive community. Yes, Path of Exile 2 is a lot more popular because it's a brand new game. A lot of people who skipped Path of Exile 1 because they were late to the boat have jumped on with Path of Exile 2, and it's doing exceptionally well. By no means does that mean Path of Exile 1 is dead, and I think this event and the up-and-coming league will show that. In fact, if anything, I think we're going to have a lot more people checking out Path of Exile 1 who have learnt and now understand Path of Exile a bit better after playing Path of Exile 2, and now they'll go, you know what, maybe I'll check out Path of Exile 1 after all. And I think some of you are going to like it better. Personally, I do prefer Path of Exile 2. but I like both games a hell of a lot, and I intend on playing, making content on both of them throughout the however many years they choose to support them both. My plea to the Path of Exile 2 Andes is to understand that Path of Exile 2 is never meant to replace Path of Exile 1. Path of Exile 1 was promised to be developed ongoing during the development and the release of Path of Exile 2. Those promises have not been fulfilled, and the Path of Exile 1 community are rightfully annoyed. So this event is a stopgap. So they've made this event, thrown it together really, really quickly. I think it's going to be a hell of a lot of fun, to be honest. Thrown it together really quickly just to give both Path of Exile 2 and especially Path of Exile 1 players just a little bit more to play with, to fill up their time with, until the next big content drop for both Path of Exile 2, which is the next content drop, and then a couple of months after that, 3.26 for Path of Exile 1. Let's go over the ascendancies now. As I said, I'm not going to go over every single one. There's 19 of them. The link is in the description. Check them out there. But there are some that I am particularly interested in that I will very likely be making some sort of build for, potentially multiple builds. Because, gosh darn it, they look fun. I think the Ranger and the Shadow in particular have some really potent looking ones. I'm probably going to start with the Surfcaster, and we'll come to that as we go down the list. But for now, let's check out the Ranger and the Daughter of Ashabi. Now, the Daughter of Ashabi is clearly very focused on wanders. If you are the sort of person who likes spell slinging and all that shenanigans, this is going to be the ascendancy for you. But it's also got some pretty nice all-round ascendancy nodes as well. For example, Oath of the Magi, you're probably going to want to spec into that during leveling pretty quickly. Defenses from equipped body armor are doubled if it has no socketed gems. 60% to all elemental resistances if you have an equipped helmet with no socketed gems. 30% increased maximum life if you have equipped gloves with no socketed gems. And 30% increased movement speed if you have equipped boots with no socketed gems. Obviously, you're not going to run around naked in terms of gems, but when you're leveling, it's not that uncommon to only have like 1 or 2 skills online. So you could basically put everything in, I don't know, maybe your armor, and probably maybe even get away with just having the armor, then benefiting from the movement speed and the additional life and the resistances elsewhere. Illuminating Wisps, pretty self-explanatory. +2 to maximum number of Sacred Wisps, +2 to number of Sacred Wisps summoned. If you combine that with the wand that you can get from the Maven, there's quite a lot of potential for all the damage. If you've not got a particularly potent PC, might want to be a little bit wary of that one, because the number of projectiles that are going to be on the screen might somewhat tank the graphics if you've got dynamic resolution on. But if you can handle it and you've got a beefy PC like myself, I think you're going to have a very, very good time, especially in combination with spell slinging skills supported by Spell Slinger have 50% increased cooldown recovery rate. Skills supported by Spell Slinger have 50% reduced mana reservation. You got Forest Tracking, 2% increased attack damage per 450 evasion rating. Rare and unique enemies within 120 meters have minimap icons. Minimap icons we don't really care that much about. It's kind of a nice quality of life. That 2% increased attack damage per 450 evasion rating, that's pretty nice indeed. Roots of the Grove, all damage inflicts poison against enemies affected by at least 5 grasping vines. Inflict 1 grasping vine on hit. So basically, you'll be poisoning all the time because you're going to inflict grasping vines on hit with every hit. And it's going to be very easy to get 5 grasping vines because of that. Your Woodland Shrines trigger level 20 create lesser shrine when you kill an enemy. Shrines are always cool. You can sometimes get a bunch of them stacking on top of each other, and it can be really, really nice, particularly actually for leveling. That might be something you might decide to go for as well as Oath of the Magi as you're leveling up, and then spec out of it later. Then you got Innate Blessing, gain a random shrine buff every 10 seconds. Likewise, it can be pretty potent. I think people are going to probably lean to one of the other 5, however, but the 2 shrine nodes in conjunction with each other, there's definitely some capacity to do some pretty broken stuff there. You've got the Whisperer. I won't go over all the nodes on this one, but if you like charge stacking, you're probably going to be very much into this one. Charge stacking pretty much works with just about any and every skill in the game in some way, shape, or form. So if that's kind of your jam, then it's definitely worth looking into the Whisperer. Next, I want to talk about the Behemoth. Now, a lot of people have looked at the Behemoth and looked at Rampager and have gone, ugh. And I don't blame them. So to explain, Rampager is 10% increased character size, which is a bit of a meme. Spell skills deal no damage. Your spells are disabled. Melee hits count as range rampage kills, and you get Rampage. Now, the main issue with this one is that your spells are disabled. That includes auras. That includes things like Berserk, which one of the other nodes here scales rage. So you might be looking at that and going, oh no, how dare you? Why would you want to do that? I think people aren't looking close enough at this ascendancy, because one, you're getting Rampage. You also get the Tireless Frenzy, which is plus 10 to maximum fortification, 1% increased attack speed per fortification, which probably means that you don't need to bother with like haste and things like that, for example. Melee hits Fortify, regenerate 0.2% of life per second per fortification through Dire Rampart. So if you're scaling Fortify, which you can also do certain things with on other gear and on the passive tree, you might be able to just make up for the lack of auras through things like that. Then you've got Sheer Fury, 15% chance that if you would gain rage on hit, you instead gain up to your maximum rage, 15 plus 15 to maximum rage. Rage gives you increased attack damage. So again, you're probably not going to need the auras or even curses that would usually give you that additional damage, because you're basically perpetually at permanent rage, maximum rage anyway. And again, you can scale some things through the passive skill tree that will scale with rage. This would have been extraordinarily potent a couple of leagues ago before they made some adjustments slash nerfs to rage, but as it is, I still think that those like 3-4 nodes in combination with each other are actually going to be like stupid strong. Final Blow is really cool. Unarmed builds are usually quite fun and you can do some wacky stuff with it. Plus 10 to unarmed melee attacks critical strike chance, which is really nice. Your critical strike chance is lucky when on low life. That is probably something that I would experiment with personally. I think that's going to be that in combination with maybe the Fortify and maybe Sheer Fury, try to wrangle that in somehow. If I can make up for attack speed elsewhere or not rely on attack speed at all, question mark. So I think Behemoth is going to be a bit of a sleeper. Next we have Surfcaster. This is probably going to be my starter. I think it's going to be a lot of people's starters. It's very, very strong for a number of reasons. Primarily, you've got Stormy Seas. 100% of lightning damage is converted to cold damage. Your cold damage can shock. I am probably going to go with a lightning arrow cast on crit and ice spear build. I'm an ice spear enjoyer. I love the way you can interact with ice spear and basically cover the entire screen with it. It does a phenomenal amount of damage, and applying shock to that bad boy is something I am very keen on trying out. You got Glacial Wave. Enemies chilled by your hits lessen their damage dealt by half of chill effect. Enemies chilled by your hits have damage taken increased by chill effect. You're dealing cold damage, so of course you would probably like to scale quite a bit of chill with that, so that synergizes it with it very, very well. And then you've got Changing Seasons. All damage taken from hits can chill you. The effect of chill on you is reversed, which means you can speed up your action speed, which includes movement and attack and or cast speed. So you scale all of the chill, which will work as both damage mitigation on monsters, but also buff the hell out of you if you can have it like hitting you as well. And then all that cold damage is also shocking, which you could probably then synergize with an Impulsor Armor, which will give you really tasty map clear. Then of course you've got Ghost of the Deep, which is also probably going to be the very first thing you spec into whilst leveling. You are touched by a tormented illegal fisherman, granting 20% increased damage, 30% increased attack speed, 30% increased cast speed, and more importantly, 30% increased movement speed, because movement speed, as I've discussed in previous videos, is king. The 2 fishing rod nodes could be kind of crazy, but I think getting a fishing rod is going to be a struggle for the vast majority of players because of this ascendancy. They're going to be extraordinarily valuable and probably out of reach for a lot of people. But if you are the sort of person who can afford one or manages to find one, again, you could probably do some pretty crazy stuff with it, especially all hits are critical strikes while holding a fishing rod. That's basically, yes, a stat stick, but you get free crit, which means you don't have to scale crit on anything else, crit chance. so you can just get all the crit multi instead. Sea Legs is pretty potent as well. Over capping on lightning or cold res can be pretty advantageous. I may potentially be speccing into this one because I'm doing cast on crit, and I'll just get all the lightning res to get the cast on crit to be very reliable. But we will have to see. If you are a minions enjoyer, I would check out Servant of Arakali, especially if you saw and liked the look of Zizaran's spider poisonish build thing that he did a league or so ago. It was very, very potent, and this ascendancy is basically that build, the ascendancy, so definitely worth checking out. I will likely be trying to do something with Herald. What I have in mind is something to do with Herald of Thunder and kind of making a build that I don't have to do a lot with in terms of combat. I can literally just walk in, hit a thing once, and then Herald of Thunder does the rest of the work. You've got Persecution, that gives +5 to critical strike chance for Herald skills, which will work quite well with Herald of Thunder. You got Future Regret, which is Herald of Thunder gains a 100% increased buff effect. Apocalypse, which is +3 to all Herald skills. And then what I'm thinking of is synergizing all of that with a jewel that is in the game that basically says that you can only have one Herald, but it buffs the crap out of it. I can't remember if it was like 50% or 100%, but it basically makes that one Herald super juicy. And then you can juice it up further with some other items as well. Mostly rings. I always forget what they're called, but the rings with the silly faces on them. I wouldn't recommend this type of build for a starter because it's very gear dependent. However, once you've accumulated some riches, there's definitely potential here, not just for Herald of Thunder, but also like Herald of Ash and particularly Herald of Ash actually, and Herald of Purity. Herald of Ash is going to be very broken, I suspect, with this ascendancy. It's probably the most obvious choice, but I like to not specifically do the obvious choice. I like to do what's fun and kind of off meta. So, but yeah, if you just want something that's going to destroy planets, probably worth looking into something similar, but with the Herald of Ash. The last one I want to cover is the Scavenger, which is the Scion Ascendancy. I'll go over it very, very quickly. But the idea of this Ascendancy is you have to spec into this first node here, and then you choose to go one way or the other. The way it's laid out will prevent you from getting both this bottom node and this top node. So you will either have to go and get your 8 points this way, or go and get your 8 points this way. Otherwise, if you try to get both, you'll fall short at one of these two nodes, depending on which one you went to first. The Ascendancy itself is exceptionally broken. There are some crazy things that you'll be able to do with this Ascendancy. If you are a softcore enjoyer, a hardcore enjoyer, whatever type of enjoyer you are, there is going to be something you can do with this ascendancy that is just going to be absolutely nutty. Let's start with the first node that you can properly get to, however, which is like the armor based node. You get to this node and you'll be able to pick one of these 5 options. You got Cloak of Flame. This one's actually particularly big. If you've been watching me stream Path of Exile 2 recently, I was using the Cloak of Flame to basically mitigate lots of damage. This used to be a very popular way to mitigate damage in Path of Exile 1, so much so that they ended up nerfing the crap out of it and like eliminating a lot of the sources of what's known as damage conversion. 40% of physical damage from hits is taken as fire damage. The idea is that you can get more defenses from your resistances than you can from armor. So you would convert the damage to an element and then use like 90 res to mitigate that damage instead of using like stacking armor to mitigate physical instead. So with Cloak of Flame, you got 40% of physical damage is from hits. The actual Cloak of Flame now currently is for damage over time, if I'm remembering correctly. So you could actually use both in tandem with each other. You can mitigate hit damage as well as damage over time. There's also the shield. I think it's Dawn Strider. That gives you a bunch of physical to fire conversion as well. So you can actually stack a fair bit of it again, like you could back in the old days. And it basically makes you immortal when it comes to physical damage. Then you got Fox Shade, 20% increased movement speed when on full life. Damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky when you are on full life. 80% increased global evasion rating when on full life. So if you're using something like Chaos Inoculation, which sets your HP to 1 HP, and then you just stack Energy Shield, you are perpetually on full life and therefore perpetually getting the benefits of Fox Shade. That's probably going to be a very, very popular one. Then for your next node, you will either go to this top one or the bottom one. This top one is more like spell / elemental based, and then the bottom one is going to be more like attack based. So you've got Midnight Bargain, +3 to maximum number of summoned phantasms. +1 to specters, +2 to raise zombies, +2 to skeletons, +3 to summoned raging spirits. The summoned raging spirits one is going to be particularly good, I think, as there is a alternative gem for summoned raging spirits that makes really, really beefy ones, but I think you can only get 6 of them, so this would add another 3, making it 9, and they do exceptionally more damage. I don't otherwise play minions, but I'm sure minion enjoyers are looking at this and salivating. Obliteration, things exploding is always a popular choice, especially if you want really fast map clear. Enemies you kill have a 30% chance to explode, dealing 1/4 of their maximum life as chaos damage. That's going to be a very fun build to experiment with. I think that's something that I might toy around with. My other option would be Void Battery, which is 25% increased spell damage per power charge, +1 to maximum power charges. Now, the unique item that usually grants this comes with a nerf or a debuff, let's say, of minus, I think it's 80% spell damage, because you can get lots of power charges. But if you combine this with 2 Void Battery 1s, so you've got 3, essentially, you're only actually getting the debuff from 2 of them and then the benefit of 3 of them, which means you can vastly outscale those negatives. So Void Battery is going to be pretty potent if you're looking for a power charge based build. Next, we have the more attack based passives. Doomfletch, gain 20% of physical weapon damage as extra damage of each element, which I think is crazy. And then lastly, coming back to this screenshot, you've got the more utility-based node, which you will have to pick something from. Death Rush, gain adrenaline for 5 seconds on kill. That, if you are just focusing on maps, is going to be pretty insane. That's 100% increased damage, 25% increased attack and cast speed and movement speed, and 10% additional physical damage reduction pretty much all the time. Not great on bossing unless you got that flask that makes worms and then you just kill the worms when you're bossing. Fury Valve, modifiers to a number of projectiles instead apply to the number of target projectiles split towards. Skills fire 2 additional projectiles. Poison Concoction enjoyers are probably staring at that one with a bit of drool dribbling down their chin. And that's it for the scavenger. There's quite a lot there. There's a lot of synergy with, like, again, I probably wouldn't necessarily start with the scavenger, but once you get some of the right equipment and then build together a really potent passive tree, these ascendancies can effectively break so many builds and put them into the OP range. I suspect the scavenger is actually going to become one of the more popular ascendancies this event, and we're going to see some very, very broken stuff from both content creators and just gamers alike. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be it for me. Hopefully that was very insightful for you and you've got all the information that you could possibly need to know about the Legacy of Phrecia event that is going to occur in just under a week's time. If you like the video, I highly recommend that you subscribe, ding the notification bell, and quite literally like the video, because it helps, of course, with the algorithm gods. I'm nearly at YouTube partner, which is quite exciting. Thank you for all those that have been around. I also stream on Twitch, on twitch.tv/Brian the Pirate, and I have a Discord, which you can get to via my Twitch channel. It's to prevent bots, and it's filled with fellow Path of Exile enjoyers, so do check it out and hang out, and we can talk about all the games and other things that you may potentially enjoy. Otherwise, that is it from me. Thank you all very much for watching. Farewell. I'll remember you. Test. Do I sound like a robot? I fucking hope not.